Hi, I'm Radical Liberation, self-declared King of the Moon. I'm talking to you from St. Louis, Missouri, United States, and I have with me this week Academic Agent. Hello, sir.
Hello.
I wanted to cover a few things real quick before we get into our main topic. First of all, Mad Mercenary, who I think is not going to be joining us today, is been busy though. He made this great banner. You can see it on YouTube, but you really see it in its full glory on our merch store. In fact, I should share that link with you all. On the merch store, you see the moon in the logo, which I think is really cool. On the YouTube channel, if you go to the YouTube channel, you'll now see the Radical Liberation with the lines going down on it. Also, he introduced, speaking of the moon, he introduced a new design, the Moon King design. And my wife, AA, was, we did a couple streams on my channel, and she actually got a lot of super chats. But, we've debated about why we did so well there. But anyway, so I made sure to give her a good chunk of the money that came in for that. And I joked that she's going to end up spending it all on our merchandise, because she's like, well, t-shirt with my husband's face on it, I got to get it,
Yeah. Give me 1 second. I'll be there right back.
Okay. Yeah, I have some other things to cover. So yeah, that's, I'll leave the merch store up for a minute with that cool design. I just love that banner that Mad Merc made. While mentioning about our community, if you go to the description of this video, you will see a Discord link. But for those who have noticed that big tech and even medium and small tech sometimes, like Discord, hasn't been kind to some of our friends, shall we say, you'll be glad to know that we are already at this point pretty well protected as a community, and it'll just get better as more and more people do a simple little step. And that is that we are now bridged. Our Discord community is now bridged to an alternative platform. So literally you can post on the alternative platform, you can post on Discord, and both sides see it. Obviously, the point is for more and more of us to be set up on the alternative platform so that if Discord pulls the plug on us, which they have had a tendency to do, then our community will be safe. So join the Discord, the Econ chat community if you haven't. And even if you have, then please make sure you're set up on our alt tech platform. And there's instructions in the community on that. So wanted to mention that. Next, I always mention his products, but since he's here, I wanted to particularly mention Academic Agent's Foundations of Logic. And I mean, I don't want to oversell it, right, AA? But you kind of used Foundations of Logic as a sort of a bridge into talking about some other things you wanted to talk about. And you put some of the things you wanted to talk about in syllogistic form, right? So there's a sort of a tie-in between these things, right?
Yeah.
Uh-oh. Can't hear you. It says you're on mute. There you go. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just think using logic and syllogisms just forces you to make your argument in as clear a way as possible, so there's nowhere to hide, either for you or your opponent.
Right. And so we actually do have a code that AA has kindly provided, tweet25, see it in the show description. And that gets you 25% off all courses, Foundations of Logic, and of course, even more directly relevant to the show in general, Foundations of Economics. In fact, just to bridge to something else real quick, I did a stream with Apostolic Majesty yesterday, here it is, on Pius XII, the myth of Hitler's Pope. And he was telling me that as a historian, he did not really know anything about economics. And it's through Academic Agent's channel and through this show that he feels like he's really been coming up to speed. And he's also taken this course, been working on this course. So he expressed his appreciation for having this new tool, you could say. And I told him I only know a handful of historians who really know their economics. Tom Woods, the late Ralph Rako, Hunt Tooley. There's not that many. And
David Hackett Fisher's a hidden one.
Oh, David Hackett Fisher knows economics. I didn't know that.
In fact, David Hackett Fisher knows logic too. It's funny how those two things often go together. And he wrote a whole book, which Apostolistic Majesty and others may be interested in, called Historians' Fallacies, where he basically goes through why historians routinely commit logical errors in their own reasoning. And it's the two subjects are linked, logic and economics, because, of course, if you know anything about Mises, or if you know anything about the Austrian school, it's all built on axiomatic reasoning.
Right.
Henry Hazlitt, famous in Austrian circles, wrote a book on logic. Right. I found out that William Stanley Jevons was also a logician.
Right.
So
and wrote an excellent text. On logic. Right?
Yeah, I mean, Jevons wasn't an Austrian economist, but he was famous for coming up with the marginal. The marginal utility, along with Menger and Valra, right?
Right.
Yep. And so the two subjects are more linked than you'd imagine, and I think a mind for one helps for a mind with the other, and vice versa. Yep.
Right. So I thought that'd be a nice segue to mention that Apostolic Majesty is pleased to be learning economics through the course. And also I wanted to mention this stream. His channel is not that big, and it ought to be bigger. And so I wanted to pump him up a bit. And also this stream in particular, I thought went really well. In short, I'll just tell you that we addressed one of the most horrendous smear jobs I have ever seen. And though we didn't address it directly, just to pique your interest a little more, I'd say that by the time you watch this stream, you'd understand why Trump is like Pope Pius XII, in what sense. And we'll see if even Apostolic Majesty follows me there. Anyway, I've dropped the link to that stream in the chat. Oh, and the Foundations of Logic link is in the chat as well now.
Just one thing to mention is, I know you want to cover some other stuff, but as a precursor to this whole discussion that we're having tonight, it's probably worth reminding everyone that on economics, me and Radlib are not going to disagree on anything.
Right.
Because the nature of the disagreement, or the nature of what I'm saying, is not rooted in economics.
Right.
But because economics in itself doesn't say this system or that system, or this tax rate or that tax rate, it just makes value-free judgments, and it really depends on what your ends are, right? So
right, exactly. Yes, I agree. Okay, so first, let's see. I think I'm going to take this down for just a moment, and I just wanted to say that we'll see if I can attend to some of the details that you brought up. I tried to at least a bit, but I have to admit I got caught up with kind of where you were driving at. So to quote you in, sorry. Make sure people have context. If you look at the description of this video, you will see 3 links to videos. That's parts 1, 2, and 3 of a series that Academic Agent did over the last few weeks, critiquing libertarian critiques of socialism, something like that. Or as I summarized it in the marketing for this discussion today, does libertarianism lead to socialism? All right. So having said that, and you should watch those videos if you haven't, here's something he says right near the end. Thoughts on what he's trying to do in these videos is thoughts on how we've ended up where we are right now. The left keep winning and something isn't right. So I've been noticing this trend, maybe in particular with, the dissident right, or reactionaries, whatever you want to call them. And that is that I think we can all feel that things have gone off the rails, right? At one point, we might have said, we think they're going to go off the rails. Earlier reactionaries would say, hey, I think we're headed in a bad direction. At this point, I think what I'm hearing more is, no, I think we're there. We're already there to a great degree. Like, we can point to things happening around us that seem very bad, and we only seem to be hurtling further in that direction. And so I've seen a lot of people struggling with, what does this mean? And where did it come from, right? If we can dig back and sort of find the origins of the problem, then we can fix it. I was particularly struck by you bringing up the some reactionaries rejecting Christianity. They go back and they say, well, what's the root of all this? It's Christianity itself, which is a pretty big thing to throw out, as you pointed out, because it's a little hard to conceive of what the West means without Christianity at this point, right? It's so intertwined with the European, with Europe, you might say, European civilization. And of course, I agree with you that they shouldn't throw Christianity out, but I would go further, just to sort of jump to the end here. My position is that to recover Christendom requires not only Christianity, of course, but also what I view as the children of Christendom. And by the way, I'm borrowing here from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the member of the famous member of the German resistance. He called them the children of Christendom. Science, art, I would say liberalism properly understood. And what we're watching, if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see I often comment on science and how I see it being distorted into scientism, or I like to use the term lysenkoism, the politicization of science. Art has become whatever John Dee does. Sorry, that was gratuitous. Many people feel that art has gone down a bad path, and we can debate that. And then liberalism, which I do think is ultimately a proper, healthy child of Christendom, understood properly. There is a distorted version of it, and I hope we can identify a little bit what that is later. But anyway, those are some overarching thoughts, but I actually want to start with a person. Someone I met right near the end of his life, and as I listened to Academic Agent's videos, this is the man that came to mind. Erich von Canaan Dean. He's an interesting figure. He was a reactionary. He was very strongly against democracy, against equality. He didn't even he wouldn't say, I'm against egalitarianism. He would say, I'm against equality. Many reactionaries might not put it that way, right? He was avowedly anti-left, pro-aristocratic, pro-monarchical. All right, so I think his bona fides as, a sort of a right winger are pretty strong. But there's something else to know about Canaan Dean. He described himself, and I'm using his terms now, as an arch liberal and even as an anarchist. So in this man, we see someone who is putting together some of the things that are usually viewed, and even in AA's videos, I think, viewed as in tension with each other. And he says, Canaan Dean says, no, these are natural, they fit together well. So I think that's quite interesting. Let me share just very briefly about him. 2 books by him that I think would be beneficial to look over. Leftism Revisited, From de Sade, that's Marquis de Sade, and Marx to Hitler and Pol Pot. Or, someone reading that might say, so everything bad is on the left, and Canaan Dean would say, yes. And then this title is particularly fitting for some of the things we're discussing, liberty or equality. And of course, his intention there is to say, you don't get both, you get one or the other. Here's a few quotes from him, just to give you a little more of the flavor of this guy. Democratism and its allied herd movements, while remaining loyal to the principle of equality and identity, will never hesitate to sacrifice liberty. Now, by the way, I think I might know, but what do you think he means when he uses the word identity there? He says democratism remains loyal to equality and identity. And is this the, self-realization stuff, which you were kind of referring to in your videos, maybe? What do you think?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what he means by that, but possibly that democracy will gravitate towards what people might call group interests. So when you think about special interests, people voting along ethnic lines, people voting along class lines, whatever it is, that's
Right.
what democracy tends towards. Maybe he's got that in mind.
That's interesting because he died, I think, before the age of what we now call identity politics. But because I met him in '96, and he died like the year later. So he's been gone for over 20 years. So he would have not been thinking of identity politics when he says this. But I wonder if basically he was foreseeing, or he was seeing it already, and it's just now we actually use the term identity politics for what he's talking about here. Anyway, a little bit more from him. The shock with which the Nazi horrors produced was so great because they came after 200 years of Rousseauian propaganda about the goodness of human nature, and also because the Germans were literate, clean, technologically progressive, hardworking, modern, sober, orderly, and so forth. Yet about human nature, we get more concrete and more pertinent information from the Bible than from statistics dealing with secondary education, the frequency of bathtubs, or the mileage of superhighways. I had to share this one, AA, because it reminded me of what you talked about near the end of your videos about materialism, right? Mm-hmm. And you see him contrasting a view of man that is materialist, you might say, right? I can count all these various things, and that tells me that these people are doing great, because I can come up with stats that make them look good. And Canaan Dean says, no, you're missing something really essential if you do that. So I thought that was interesting. Few more. 51% of a nation can establish a totalitarian regime, suppress minorities, and still remain democratic. When I met Canaan Dean, it was at a Philadelphia Society meeting. And my first interaction with him was public before I spent hours hanging around with him. He gave a speech. He criticized democracy, as he always does. I later learned. I didn't know anything about him at the time. And I stood up, having read Mises, right? You know exactly the passages I'm talking about, eh? I stood up and said, well, at least democracy allows for the peaceful transition of rule. And he said, yes, the peaceful transition of rule, August 1933. I probably got the rule wrong, the month wrong. August 1933, Germany, So anyway, that's his point here. So I got a little public shaming as my introduction to Canaan Dean as a young libertarian. Europe's rise, he writes, is written in the terms of Christianity and monarchy. Europe's decay in the terms of republicanism, progressivism, and godlessness. And then two more. It is the low drive for sameness and the hatred of otherness that characterizes all forms of leftism, which inevitably are totalitarian. And then finally, this one's hard to read, sorry. It was never forgotten by Catholic nations that the merchants and money changers were the only people physically chastised by our Lord. I thought I'd throw that one in just for the spice. Okay, so Canaan Dean, I think, is quite interesting. And I mostly bring him up because I feel like I probably don't have all the answers, but I think he might have. Oh, I'm sorry, there is one more story I had to tell. Canaan Dean, in a speech that you can find on the Mises Institute website, he was talking about Mises. He knew a lot about. He came from the same place as Mises, right? So he described the setting of Mises's life and so forth. And it's a very interesting speech because he touches on a lot of the themes I'm talking about here. What he views as a compatibility between aristocracy and anarchism, for instance. It's an amazing talk. So you all may know of that the few surviving classical liberals decided to form a society around the time of World War II. And the three leading figures, Mises, Hayek, and Repke, proposed that the name should be the de Tocqueville-Acton Society, right? So Lord Acton and de Tocqueville. Someone stood up to object. You're not going to be surprised entirely, perhaps, AA. Frank Knight of the University of Chicago. He stood up and he said, if you call that society after two Roman Catholic aristocrats, I'll quit. So they didn't know what to do, and they named it after the location they were in, Mont Pelerin, and it became known as the Mont Pelerin Society. The reason that Canaan Dean likes to tell this story, I think, is because in his view, liberalism properly understood, they should have named it the de Tocqueville-Acton Society, because in his view, liberalism flows from aristocrats, from Catholic Europe, Christian Catholic Europe, and so forth. So I thought that was a very telling story, and that Frank Knight from the Chicago School, right, who, by the way, was one of the worst Christian bigots I've ever heard of, short of like commies. He literally, there'd be like a nun in class, and he would just spend the whole time berating the nun until the nun left, and then he'd say, okay, now we can have our class. Like he treated Christians like, I can't think of a word to use that I can get away with, but you get the idea. He treated Christians really poorly. Okay, so let's turn now to the slides, which I have ready to go, right? Yep. Let me pull these up. And let's at least run over a few of the points. And I wanted to focus in a little bit on negative and positive liberty. In particular, AA, I had never really read Berlin's essay. And I took a look at just some key excerpts. And I think it's a lot more relevant to the things you were saying than I would have guessed. So I think that'll repay a little bit of attention. Okay, so now it's interesting that you talk about socialism and liberal. I'll just use the term liberalism, and here we mean, of course, not social democracy, but the party of freedom, right? The tradition of political liberty. So we're using liberalism in what you might call the older or the European sense, something like that. It was in fact Rothbard, when he was trying to cross the aisle and reach to the left or whatever, who said that indeed he thought that socialists were pursuing libertarian ends by conservative means. And what he meant by that, this is in his essay, Left and Right, Prospects for Liberty, something like that. He meant that at least the proclaimed goals of socialism were, like you point out here, material prosperity and freedom and things like that. But they were using conservative means, by which he meant the state, which he viewed traditionally as something, when you think of the Anti-Corn Law League, right? They were fighting against people in alliance with the state to preserve privileges, legalized legal privileges. And so that's how Rothbard cast it, at least at that point. So in a way, you making this point, I mean, Rothbard made this exact same point. But you mean it as a critique to say that they share the goals, right?
Yeah.
So spell that out a little bit.
So, I'm not sure that total freedom is the aim for any society. It is explicitly the aim of the Enlightenment man, right? It's explicitly the aim of Immanuel Kant, for example. It's the aim of Rousseau, even though obviously there are contrasting definitions of what freedom means, but still, they're driving towards some sort of liberty, whether it's liberty from something or liberty to do something. And I am not convinced of that fundamental premise that freedom is the only aim, or should be the top aim, or what they call the summum bonum in ethics, the highest good.
Right. Well, Acton seemed to have stated it the best that I can think of. He said, liberty is the highest political end. So Acton, of course, would not view liberty as the highest end. He would just say, if you're focused on politics, which is basically, when is it appropriate to use coercion and what should the law be and stuff like that, then the goal is to preserve liberty. In terms of virtue and things like that, which is a higher goal for someone like Acton, right? It's not that isn't an important goal. It's just that it's not a political goal. So he would distinguish between political sphere of life versus other spheres of life. So, for Acton, the church would reign supreme in regards to, our moral and ethical life, right?
Yeah. So, one of the, I guess, difficulties that I have with this whole way of thinking, Acton's framework or anyone from the liberal tradition's framework in itself, is that as I have come to understand the elite theorists more and more, what Acton is calling the political there, I am not convinced can be escaped per se, i.e. whatever society it is going to end up with something approaching the same structure. It's just who is the person with their hand on the cage, so to speak.
Right, and in particular, you've been questioning the usual automatic response of people is, well, okay, we're not going to have heaven on earth, right? We accept that, but surely, some societies are super oppressive, and some societies are like really awesomely free. And you've actually been challenging that recently, right? And saying, I think that maybe the people who think that they're free are maybe less free than they think they are. And those people over there who we think are, just in grinding domination at all times, have you actually talked to them and asked them what it's like, right?
Yeah, and well, I mean, my basic contention is that all systems, whatever you call them, are effectively the same in form. It's just a case of who is on top. And viewed in that context, liberalism becomes a convenient argument for a particular class of people at a particular time. And once they actually then get into power, if you want to put it this way, which takes the whole of the 19th century to actually happen, once they're in power, they no longer have need of the doctrine of freedom, much like the left.
I was going to say, it's well recognized that, communists would be all fighting for free speech 60 years ago, 70 years ago, right? Yeah. When they felt like their speech was threatened. And now that they're on top, we see exactly what they really think of free speech, right?
Exactly. So everybody's for freedom until they're in power. And then all of a sudden, So that's one of the things that I think we have to be aware of is, yes, Cobden, yes, Bright, Manchester School, Corn Laws, but what were those people arguing for if not their own empowerment over the old aristocracy and the old order? And lo and behold, once that class of people attain power, they metamorphize into the managerial class or managerial elite, and in fact, what then happens is you get progressively more maneuvering to disenfranchise what was called the bourgeoisie. What we would call now the small business owner, which was the heart of the original bourgeois class. Right. Then gets kind of outfoxed by the civil servant and the corporate employee, if you want to put it that way, who make up the ranks of the managerial class. So
and then in the last year, it's just become almost hard to miss for everybody that the small businessman is getting absolutely crushed. Right.
Well, I mean, quite literally shut down by the government.
Yeah.
Right. Which then favors the big corporation who already got an advantage, even more of an advantage for for them.
Now,
So
I would just make one minor point real quick, which is simply to say that because some use, say, freedom of speech or free trade as an instrumental, they make an argument that we look back and we wonder if it was, not maybe kind of a selfish use of it, right? That doesn't mean that free speech or free trade isn't valuable, right? Just because some people abuse something doesn't mean that the thing is not a good thing. If you see the distinction I'm making.
Yeah, but I mean, did the church, right, argue for religious freedom when they were in power? No. The church only started arguing.
Catholic Church.
Right? The church only started arguing for religious freedom when they were out of power.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So now it's a talking point because the church has been crushed by secular forces.
Right.
And is out of power. But when the church was in power, it didn't in fact, it characterized itself by an intolerance of other faiths. And as soon as they let in those other faiths, that was the beginning of the end. So part of my reasoning is built on how there is going to be a group on top, right? Even in theoretical Ankepistan, you won't get around this, as I've talked about before. You'll still get this basic structure. It's just that the mechanisms will be private rather than public. And Hopper's talked about this. Technically, the entire medieval era, 1381, John Smith lived in a private system of power, not a state. Which is
and that's something that a lot of folks might miss, and I wouldn't mind if I think it wouldn't hurt for you to comment briefly on it, which is that sometimes people seem to talk about the state as just the king of Babylon was the state, and the duke in the middle of the Middle Ages was the state, and someone was just telling me that they think that the medieval Europe lived under a centralized state because the church was effectively a central government. I don't accept that, but but I noticed that, say, someone like Hoppe tends to talk about the state as a modern phenomenon, not as an ancient phenomenon. So why would he make that distinction? Do you accept it?
It's the development of the mass state, of the mass man. In the old feudal order, technically, your allegiance was to your lord, and then beyond allegiance to your lord, allegiance to the king, and it was an honor system all the way up and down, loyalty and honor system based on private relationships between liege and vassal, and the embodiment of the country was seen to be the king. So I don't know, the King of France was also called France. He was called Charles something, or Louis, more often than not Louis something, right? But he'd also just be called France, as embodied in the person. Whereas by the time you get to modern day France is not Emmanuel Macron. When Emmanuel Macron goes to Davos, nobody addresses him as France, right? Because France is seen to be embodied in the quote unquote people in the mass. This is something that Gustave Le Bon, among others, talks about in his book The Crowd, and this is something that there's a lot of late 19th century literature on coping with that shift over from monarchy to parliamentary systems. Herbert Spencer called it the divine right of parliament. So
when you bring up fealty, there's a theme I want to keep hitting as we go, and I'll start now. When you bring up the systems of fealty, oaths, I don't know what the right terminology is, right? But private relationships, often with some kind of promise, mutual promise to each other, right? Number one, it wouldn't be quite right to think of it as contracts. I think that would be to be, I'm forgetting the word. When you talk about something modern and stick it into something that's old.
Anachronistic.
Anachronistic. It'd be anachronistic to say that your relationship to your lord in the Middle Ages was a contractual relationship. Do you follow me? They would not have thought of it quite that way, even though it had aspects of that. It was
there are complications around this question. There are complications around this question because originally, by which I mean back in the 570 AD or something like this, 600 AD, the very original serfs, when they pledged their oath, would have, in theory, signed some sort of contract. In theory, but I think by the time you get to, let's say, I don't know, 1100, that notion of the actual contract was probably forgotten. But then, to complicate matters even further, a long time ago, I made these videos on the decline of feudalism and the rise of capitalism, which that feudal system in England, which is, let's face it, where we care about, and in France, had largely broken down by about 1400 or even earlier. So 1381 John Smith, even my example, wasn't really living in a truly feudal order even back then. So when we say he's got a lord, he wasn't working for that lord through an oath of fealty. He was paying him rent. That lord was essentially his landlord.
Right.
So that's just a little wrinkle in there. That
right. So going back older than 1381, then to the oath of fealty era, right? I guess what strikes me, as I mentioned, is that way of having long-term relationships through, mutual promises, right? That are viewed, I think you'd agree, they would have viewed them in a sort of spiritual light, right? It wasn't just a business contract. There was honor around it. There was something spiritual about it. To break it was to do something, not just like, illegal in the sense of breaking a contract. It was to be doing something bad, right?
If you could Google, Radlib, the Great Chain of Being and share images.
My point in bringing this up is that it seems to me one of the only things we have left, and maybe others can give me better examples, is marriage. And of course, that, as we know, is in tatters almost at this point, right?
Oh, don't get me started on marriage at first sight, Radlib. Tell you, that show is just disgusting. Yeah, so if you just click on that first image there, just the very first one, and make it bigger, maybe like view file, I don't know.
Okay, can we see that?
If you just click view file in there to make it bigger, I don't know.
Oh, you're not seeing it very large.
You see on the right, it says view file. It just brings up the image larger.
Oh, huh. Okay, sorry. Something's not working right. I actually had it in the right place. I didn't share the right tab. I shouldn't share tabs. I'm slowly learning. Here we go. That's what I wanted.
Okay, so
yeah,
this is the Great Chain of Being. At the top is God, right?
Right.
At the bottom is Satan. Then above Satan, you have inanimate matter, stones and things like this. Okay. Above that, you have vegetation, trees, turnips, carrots and cabbages, plant life. Then above that, again, you've got all of the animals, which are ranked within themselves. So, for example, a lion is above a bird. Even within the birds, the eagle is above a sparrow, say, right?
Right.
And then just below God, you've got the angels.
Heavenly beings, yeah.
Yeah. and in between animals and angels, you have mankind. God said to Adam, you have dominion over the earth and all of the creatures. So mankind is seen as the link between the heavenly beings, the angels, and the animal life. So you're above all the animals, but you're below the angels. And within mankind, just as the animals were ranked from elephants and lions at the top to rabbits and mice and cockroaches down at the bottom, right? So human beings were ranked. The king was said to be the closest being to God, and therefore he was at the top of the chain. The villain or the peasant or the serf was right down the bottom of that, and therefore was low. And then there were ranks in between. So the duke was above the earl, and the earl was above the a knight, and so on and so forth.
Which doesn't sound too distant from the Indian caste system, say, right?
Right. So the justification of this oath, the pledge, was held in place by the great chain. It wasn't just an oath to a person; it was an oath to God himself. So to go against your Lord would be to go against God. And this was the theoretical basis under which somebody like 1381 John Smith would have lived. I mean, it's funny.
It's worth mentioning that the other direction, right? That I think someone higher could also fail to do their duty to someone lower.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, it's funny I mentioned 1381 because the King of England at that time was Richard II, who famously wasn't a very good king. He had a lot of favorites at court. He was a bit frivolous. He was, he rose taxes to a point which was caused revolts, and he was overthrown by Henry IV, by Bolingbroke, and he believed completely in divine right. And so, how do you deal with this problem? Like, you've got like this system works, but what if the king's bad? A modern might say. And I mean, in the theory of the time, despite the fact that Richard II was not the best king, strictly speaking, to go against the great chain, as Henry IV did, was to go against God. So this was a terrible, like a sacrilege to overthrow the rightful king. And in the theory of the time, the War of the Roses, which came afterwards, was pretty much God's punishment on England for this transgression against the great chain, which was then, I mean, in the ideology of the Tudor court, healed by God when he sent Henry VII to defeat Richard III on the battlefield, thereby healing the rift. That's how it was written up by the winning side, right?
Right.
But strictly speaking, Richard II shouldn't have been killed for this order to have maintained itself. So, what I'm trying to say is, it's in the real world, it wasn't without its problems, even in 1381.
Yeah, right.
but John Smith, the blacksmith, would have seen himself as, in the service of this great chain. He would have seen his Lord above him, not just in social status, but in kind of heavenly status as well.
Right. And one of the concerns you bring up, you put it in the sense of having too many choices of, what do you do with your life, right? And the oversimplified version is, John Smith is just going to be a blacksmith like his father and his grandfather before him. But, you could imagine maybe something slightly less extreme was realistic, that a tradesman might go into some trade. It might not exactly be what his father did, but it might be.
I mean, I was painting with very broad brushes because I was trying to use the extremes to make a point.
Sure.
But again,
right. But then on the other hand, on the other end, though, is what you seem particularly concerned about, which is where you kind of are lost at sea, right? You have very little guidance and direction from society, I guess, or at least it seems that way.
right.
And you could just go anywhere, and isn't this great? And you're saying, well, is it great, right?
Yeah, there are some nuances that I left out of my video that I should mention here for the sake of completeness.
Okay.
And it's actually something discussed by Richard Cantillon, who I believe was writing in 1730, so not that far removed from this period. Just a little bit later, 400 or 500 years later. But when was 1381, 1380, 14, 15?
That'd be 400.
So 400 years later, Richard. But this system was still kind of still going in some ways. Even though there were some changes at the top, the basic way of life didn't change. And Cantillon actually discusses this very scenario. Like, he's like, well, the black, does he talk about blacksmiths or a farmer or
I'm not remembering,
maybe a tailor or something? But it's in his excellent treatise on commerce, and he's saying, like, don't think that somebody like this isn't still, today we'd call it opportunity costs, but he uses a kind of different phraseology. But essentially, he's talking about opportunity costs. Don't think that a dad like John Smith isn't having to make what we'd recognize as economic calculations. He has got two sons, not just little John Smith, but little Richard Smith, say. But there's only one place to be his apprentice. So what happens to Richard Smith now? And, he's got to make choices. So he can't have him working in the shop. There's not enough space for him. So does he send him away to get training as an apprentice to do something else? Go and be a carpenter, say? Or does he, and there's all sorts of calculations that come with that, costs and, time commitment. And so there was, even in 1381, the picture was not as static as I was making it out. The second son probably wouldn't be a blacksmith there. He may have not even been a blacksmith. He might have gone and trained as an apprentice with John Smith's mate to go and be a tailor or something. Or, maybe if he was lucky, he'd possibly even make it to learn how to read and write and go and be a priest or something. Possibly, like, it's not unheard, not impossible. But more likely, he would have ended up doing another trade, or if he fell down, because you can move down the social order as well as up, he would have ended up as a labourer, farm labourer or something like that. But that would have been
to bring some complexity to that, and I cannot seem to get my own channel to load. But anyway, I think
this is a YouTube-wide problem. I was having the same issue.
Oh, okay.
But I'm seeing
I won't try then. But
yeah.
We did a show on the Industrial Revolution of the Middle Ages, and I was talking about stuff 1,000 years ago that was happening, right? Which would have certainly shaken up some of these traditional things. So there was certainly some dynamism going on in the Middle Ages, some of which is sort of lost to us because it's just been so long, and also lost to us because the Middle Ages, as you and I have been discovering, doesn't get very accurate press. It's fair to say.
It's smeared. It's smeared.
It's smeared.
This is another problem with liberalism, Radlib. It keeps lying about history to boost itself, which you're not happy about.
Yeah, right. Okay, so let's go back to the slides, having touched on a lot of good stuff. Here we go, and make sure we get to some other things.
This is good, Radlib, because this is the sort of detail you don't get to go into. That video was already 45 minutes long, right? So I couldn't go into a whole side lecture on the Great Chain of Being in the middle of it, So.
You could, but right. Oh, okay, so actually, I shouldn't have even put this up. So you brought up Isaiah Berlin's two concepts of liberty, and I think I don't know if you'd looked at the original I guess it was a speech or a lecture, right? Yeah. So I actually highlighted a few things, and I should have not even shared that because I should have gone right to this. Let me just pull this up. Here we go. Yeah, there's some surprising bits in here related to the things that you were talking about in these videos. First of all, just to cover the basics, this is his two concepts of liberty, and this particular thing here is excerpts. It's not the full thing, as I understand it. And he talks about negative freedom or liberty versus positive freedom or liberty. So what is negative freedom? It's what libertarians usually are on about, right? It involves coercion, deliberate interference of other human beings within the area in which I could have otherwise acted. You lack political liberty or freedom only if you're prevented from attaining a goal by human beings. Mere incapacity, this is really important, mere incapacity to attain a goal is not lack of political freedom. And this is one of those areas where word games go on, language games go on with the left, right?
Yeah.
They say, well, you're not really free if you can't, go on a yacht like Bill Gates does, or whatever, right? And a negative freedom point of view would say, no, you can be free and broke or whatever, right? Freedom is not everything. It's not all good things. It's this one thing, and you can have it and not have other good things. Like, as you have been pointing out in the videos, you could be free in this sense, have negative freedom and not be virtuous, right? No one's preventing you from doing good things. You just choose not to do them, right? And as I said, you could be free and lacking in wealth or skills or whatever, right? So anyway, that's just to lay down some basics for everybody. But I actually wanted to skip forward. There we go. Listen to this. And remember Canaan Dean, who I was bringing up at the beginning. Liberty in this sense, the negative sense, is not incompatible with some kinds of autocracy. Liberty in this sense is principally concerned with the area of control, not with its source. So just as a democracy may in fact deprive the individual citizen of a great many liberties, which he might have in some other form of society, so it's perfectly conceivable that a liberal-minded despot would allow his subjects a large measure of personal freedom. And in that speech I mentioned by Canaan Dean, he says pretty much exactly this. He says, liberalism can happen under a dictator. He says, I care about whether I am free. I have that sphere of freedom. I don't care so much. He says, my vote is a little drop in the sea, right? So, over here I have a vote, over here I don't have a vote. Who cares? What kind of freedom do I have in my personal life is what I'm looking at in terms of liberty, right? This probably would have been a more shocking thing to say a little over a year ago, AA. But when we read a democracy may in fact deprive the individual citizen of a great many liberties, I think now we all, it's harder to argue against this today than it was a year ago, right? So he says, freedom in this sense is not at any rate logically connected with democracy or self-government. And this is one of the things that Hoppe, one of the earliest talks I remember from him, the paradigm shifting talks as usual, was him saying, this is one of the areas where the classical liberals really got it wrong. Some of the classical liberals saw liberty as connected to democracy. And as we got rid of monarchs, say, and replaced monarchies with democratic forms of government, liberty would go up. And Hoppe said that was a horrible mistake. That was wrong. Yeah. And he, of course, views liberalism as able to be cleansed of that mistake and still be liberalism and not lose itself, right? That you can have that emphasis on liberty. And Canaan Dean felt the same way. You can have that emphasis on liberty and realize that democracy is a bad game to play, right? So just a little bit more here. The answer to the question, who governs me, is logically distinct from the question, how far does government interfere with me? It is in this difference that the great contrast between the two concepts of negative and positive liberty in the end consists. That's his claim. I'm not sure I've completely absorbed that, but A little bit more, the connection between democracy and individual liberty is a good deal more tenuous than it seemed to many advocates of both. The desire to be governed by myself, or at any rate to participate in the process by which my life is to be controlled, may be as deep a wish as that of a free area for action and perhaps historically older, but it is not a desire for the same thing. So and then further, so then now turning to positive liberty, he says the positive sense of the word liberty derives from the wish on the part of the individual to be his own master.
Yeah.
So, yeah, now, first of all, is this your understanding? Because I have to say, I thought positive liberty, I was thinking of it more in the sort of like FDR's freedom from want and stuff. You know, basically when people say, you know, you have a right to medical care, and the libertarians like me come along and say, well, that you're basically enslaving doctors to people, right? If you say they have a right to medical care, or enslaving the people who will pay for it or whatever. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I understood it as in the sense of the French Revolution, you know, we are not going to be free until we overthrow the king and erect our own government.
Right. And right. then this is where they talk about the will of the people and all this sort of stuff, right?
Exactly.
Then it'll be what did they call it? From the January 6th thing? I'd never heard this before. The People's Chamber, right?
People's Chamber, yeah.
Then it'll be the People's Chamber. It won't be, you know, the private preserve of, you know, the king and the lords and stuff. It'll be ours. And therefore we will be free because we will be ruling ourselves.
I'm the captain now.
I'm the captain now. Yes, thank you. Perfect. So anyway, I found it quite striking that in this paper he made this concession, which he seems to be, you know, he's just being rigorous and making this point, but he doesn't seem to be quite comfortable, you know, with this idea that, you know, maybe a dictator is just fine, right?
Yeah, but I mean, you can see Berlin is treading carefully because he doesn't want to fall out with all his liberal buddies and his leftist Oxford friends and so on and so forth. Yeah. So
you're saying he's secretly a reactionary? You can feel it.
Well, Berlin is a how can I say, one of these guys who's a bit like Hayek, you know, difficult to pin. In fact, I think Berlin has an excellent essay on, was it hedgehogs and two different types of thinkers? Yeah. Right, was it hedgehogs and
foxes? I thought, yeah.
Is it foxes and hedgehogs? And Hayek's got a similar point. And in fact, I think Hayek quotes Berlin when he says, "Listen, I'm a hedgehog. I muddle through, and Mises was a fox. He builds systems. He's a great thinker, you know. Whereas I'm just confused all the time." And Berlin, I think, saw himself more as a kind of hedgehoggy type guy who's just trying to make sense of things. And it's not like a diss. You need both of those two different types of thinkers in the world.
I'm glad you say that, because I think you and I are that very distinction. I think I'm a little bit more on the hedgehog side and you're a bit more on the, you know, rigorously think everything through side. You know, you're more the Mises, Rothbard, Hoppe sort. And I feel a little more like I'm like Hayek, you know. I read Hayek saying that and I really connected with what he said. It made a lot of sense to me.
I mean, there are pros and cons though, because if you're more systematic, it does mean that you have wilder swings when you change your mind on something. Does that make sense? It's like, oh right, well I was wrong. So
it makes sense if you're describing yourself. That's for sure.
I was wrong, and now I think this thing, which is completely a different thing.
The opposite.
Whereas if you're a hedgehog, you can say, oh, you know, this, but then again this, but then again this.
Right.
You know, so it's like,
right.
Yeah.
I have a lot of intuition in the way I feel my way towards these things. Let me see if there's anything else. Oh, yeah. Okay. So I'm heading somewhere, by the way, lightly and gently here. And so that's why I highlighted these words. So the positive freedom, he wants to be his own master, right? And he talks later about you want to bear responsibility for your choices, able to explain your choices by reference to your own ideas and purposes. Now, this may not be striking to many of my secular friends, but Christians see that, and they perhaps immediately think of Jesus's words thy will, not mine, be done, right? So this seems that somehow immediately doesn't feel quite right to the Christian, who views themselves as trying to seek God's will and to some degree subordinate your own ideas and purposes to something higher, right? And you were kind of getting at this with near the end when you talked about a materialist view and the we'll get to it, but the Crusaders, right? There is probably the ruling view right now is that if there's something higher, it's just your own idea of yourself, and it's sort of reached its reductio ad absurdum now with I am just whatever I identify myself as being, right?
Yeah,
I create myself, right?
Not just picking your own morality, but picking your own gender, picking your own race, even,
and all kinds of things, right? That great painting comes to mind, Napoleon crowning himself, right?
Mm-hmm.
It feels like now we all crown ourselves, right? At this point, we're not submitted to a higher vision of what it means to be a human, right? To be a man.
Yeah.
We have to define that for ourselves, or we feel that we do, or feel that we have the right to, or whatever. So that struck me. And then he uses the magic word, and this is kind of where I was heading: autonomous. Years ago, I was talking to Roderick, who I just was totally praising last week in sharing his great paper. But Roderick Long, I don't know if you know about him, AA, but you ought to. He's a left libertarian, super sharp. You can learn very, very much from him. But he is certainly on cultural matters in alignment with current sort of left-wing trends, last I knew. And I remember listening to him and thinking, his high value here is autonomy. That is what he really holds dear, and that's how he's reaching these positions on cultural matters and so forth. It's all about the autonomous self. And that autonomy, again, speaking as a Christian for a moment, that autonomy means autonomy from God, or if you prefer, from anything higher than my own self. Right?
Yeah.
And so some of the time when you're talking about liberalism in these videos, I, in my head, am thinking more of this, which, it's a further discussion to talk about what is the relationship between the autonomy or autonomism or whatever you want to call it and liberalism. But for a moment, let's just treat it as its own thing. I think we all know it, even if we haven't had a word for it, because it's in the air we breathe, right? This desire that I should not be held, of course, by any vows or oaths like in the past, right? Even the marriage vow now, it would be viewed as horrendous that someone would stay in a marriage when they don't feel like being in the marriage anymore. Or something, right?
I mean, to give you an example, I hate to bring up this bloody show, Married at First Sight, but let me tell you something that happened.
You bring it up. You bring it up every week, but go ahead.
Right, let me tell you something that happened in the show.
Yeah.
The process is meant to be: you meet each other on the day of your marriage, okay, and then over the course of the show, you decide if you want to stay with each other. You get married first, and then you decide if you're going to stay together. Okay. Well, during the course of this show, there were all these different couples. One man and one woman ended up cheating, i.e., they started an affair in the middle of the show. And when it came to the deciding ceremony or whatever the hell they call it, they pleaded that they should be able to stay in the show with each other and send the spouses that they cheated on back home, basically. And the producers agreed to it, and they ended up staying all the way through, having cheated. So they started a new relationship out of the unfaithful, and they ended up staying. So that's what happened during the course of the show, and it was ratified by the the quote unquote experts of the show that this should go on, because they found quote unquote each other or true love or whatever,
right.
within the confines of the process. And I mention that because that is putting, the idea of individual happiness or the autonomous self above everything, even the rules of the show.
Right.
And in the kind of values of this moment, the producers thought, well, either it would make good TV, or let's just change the rules to accommodate the kind of gratuitous, narcissistic, appetites of these two, obviously grotesque people.
It almost seems an illustration of your point about the law, right? The show had a law, right? That you have to, we arrange this marriage, and then you have to stick with it or not stick with it or whatever, but you have to do that through the show. Well, these folks did, the sort of the cultural, cultural devotion, autonomy. They went with that, and the rules of the show bended to the real power. Right.
Exactly. So, but if you want to put it this way, they exercise their positive liberty, and the producers of the show gave them the negative liberty to do it. And I suppose my argument is that in practice, it often works the other way around, that the negative liberty is removed, which then kind of produces the positive, it produces the positive liberty, which is, another word for degeneracy, essentially.
So a little more from Berlin, because he touches on some another point that came to mind. Because I'm a hedgehog, I'm throwing some things out, and I'm hoping that it's in some sense connecting for people. He's talking about positive liberty, and he gets into this thing about how people start talking about what is your true interest. It might be that the choice you're making isn't the best choice for you, but we who are wiser, we know what's the best choice for you. Or the real freedom, higher freedom, as he says here, higher freedom is to do this rather than what you're choosing right now. And he's very concerned about this. He says, once I take this view, I am in a position to ignore the actual wishes of men or societies, to bully, oppress, torture them in the name and on behalf of their real selves, in the secure knowledge that whatever is the true goal of man, happiness, fulfillment, duty, wisdom, a just society, self-fulfillment, must be identical with his freedom, the free choice of his true, albeit submerged and inarticulate self. And so actually what this brought to mind is something I've been thinking about a lot. So this might connect in a way you don't expect. Progress, right? I think, as I highlighted in that stream about Industrial Revolution, the Middle Ages, progress was happening before anybody started talking about progress with a capital P, right? In my view, because of the good things that were coming from Christendom, the decentralization, the liberalism, and many other, the monasteries, many things came together to start producing what we now would call progress, right? And that's all well and good, and maybe at a certain point, it's just organically happening. At a certain point, people started noticing it and becoming conscious of it and aiming at it, right? And I might say that the Anti-Corn Law League was a good example, a good outcome of that sort of thing. But what I've been thinking about a lot for years now is the flip side of that, which is that having once consciously recognized, ooh, there's this progress thing, it seems good, then some people decided to force progress down our throats, right?
Yeah.
Not just let it happen as a sort of an organic outcome of a healthy society, whatever, but sort of drive us toward it till ultimately we get to where we are now, which we often call the line go up phase, right? Where as long as we can make the numbers that we're focusing on, GDP or whatever it is, as long as that line is going up, then things are great. Even though, it's the dog in the burning room, right? Everything's fine. Line's going up as society's burning around them, right?
We could use the example of the married at first sight couple as a way into this question, right? Through analogy. This is not me making an argument by analogy. I'm just using an analogy to illustrate fans of foundations of logic. Okay. Which is, okay, we could say, well, the progressive thing to do would be to give in and let the couple stay in the process because they found true love through cheating on their respective partners and finding each other. Okay. So let's change the law because the law is an ass, because the happiness line has gone up. Just put it that way. They're both more happy with each other than they would have been had they been forced out of the process, by playing by the rules. Okay. Now you could see the corn laws like that in a way. Everybody would be more happy if we just relax these punitive tariffs. More people will be fed, more people can be born, line will go up. But there is an argument to say that the reason that the laws were there, the rules were in place in the first place, is because society had developed in such a way that people had learned. The ancient wisdom had. It's not for us to question the ancient wisdom. It had just kind of been handed down to us that this is the way it is, and you take that away, and hark what discord follows, as Ulysses in Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida put it. Take but degree away, and hark what discord follows. Well, if you take away the sanctity of marriage and you just let people decide willy-nilly whether they're going to stay or leave, or willy-nilly whether they're going to break one marriage off and start a new one just because they've followed their loins, they followed lust into the bedchamber, hark what discord, like, what's going to happen to society if you just let that reign? And in the same way, you just let any old grain come into this country, you let cheap American grain come in, and this whole way of life that we've known for hundreds of years is going to be completely overturned. And, before you know it, it's trans story hour.
Yeah, and I haven't been buying this story that this is the fault of liberalism, as you know. Liberalism, in the sense I mean it, because I think that in between, the elimination of the corn laws and trans story hour, there's been a lot of non-liberal things going on, right? I mean, the 20th century is not the century of libertarianism. It's the century of the total democratic state, as Hoppe would put it.
The handmaiden, Radlib, the handmaiden was liberalism. Just like, right? Imagine the show producers had come out down and said, no, the rules are the rules. We lay down the law. That would be illiberal. Right, the illiberal thing to do would be to lay down the law. The liberal thing to do was to let it go. Would you agree with that? To relax the rule and let the couple stay in the process was the liberal thing to do, and to maintain the law was the illiberal thing to do. Would you agree with that?
Well, I don't know how you're using the word anymore, and that's part of the problem I have with this whole line of thought is that the liberalism shifts definitions constantly.
No. The illiberal thing, the liberal thing to do always is to take away a law that stops you doing something. So, a law that says you can't buy heroin legally is illiberal. The liberal thing to do is to take away the law. A law that says you cannot import corn into this country, otherwise we're going to tax 90% of your takings. So you might as well, you have to, by law, buy your corn from the farmer down the road, not from this American or Frenchman. The liberal thing to do is to repeal that law. You'd agree, right? And in the same way, the liberal thing to do would be to relax the law that says couples who have decided to leave have to bloody leave the process rather than stay in the process because they've cheated on their partner.
So the example that was coming to mind, actually, while listening to your videos, I think is relevant now. Somewhat infamously in real conservative circles, Ronald Reagan, as you may know, before he was president, was governor of California. And he signed into law the first no-fault divorce legislative change in the United States. Okay,
Yeah,
and
it was the liberal thing to do.
Many social conservatives view that as, you know, one of many turning points down the road that we're now deep down, right? So, what is the liberal option? Is it to, you know, give people the option to just easily leave marriage, or is it to uphold, you know, the marriage vow, the fealty that we pay to that we promise to each other, right? So in my mind, it's not so totally clear, because liberalism to me means justice, law, contract, right? These are all things that are very sacred in the liberal tradition. To make it easy to break contracts is certainly autonomy, right? It's that autonomous view, that positive liberty view, maybe. But I don't know that it's liberalism. Do you follow the distinction I'm making?
Yeah, but I feel like I feel like the liberal argument would always be to err on the side of making things easier to do, to making business decisions easier to do, to making it easier to break contracts, to make it easier to file a divorce, to make it easier to, because all of these things are impediments. They're all examples of coercion. My negative liberty is being impacted because of the constraint being put in place, which is why I'm ultimately arguing that the distinction between positive and negative liberty breaks down, because the repeal of the negative of the repeal of the law, which is the negative liberty part of it, is almost always the handmaiden to the positive liberty part of it. You know, so the next step would be, oh, now we're going to make a law to kind of mandate the fact that you can immediately leave a marriage and marry the person you cheat on them with, or something like that. You know, that would be the next step afterwards. So yeah, my sense is always towards that the liberal is going to want to repeal the law rather than maintain some existing law. That would be my instinct on that question.
Sure, but I just don't know that that's the liberal being a liberal. Right.
Well, I mean,
you know, because my understanding of classical liberalism and libertarianism is that it is focused on interdependence. And in my view, this focus on autonomy is actually, though it has been mixed up with it, as liberalism in our country, for example, has been mixed up with social democracy of all things, though it's been mixed up with it, I think it is logically distinct. And in many ways, I think at loggerheads with it, so that, like I said, contract is a really big deal in liberalism and economics, for that matter, right? And to make it easy to break contracts doesn't feel like liberalism to me, as I understand it, though it does feel like autonomy. So I see a tension between, you could call them strains within liberalism if you prefer, but a tension between the emphasis on interdependence, that is, you know, society can run by itself, laissez-faire, laissez-passer, right? Society can run by itself because we are able to cooperate together, to be interdependent, right? There's that.
If there was a regulation in place, if there was a regulation in place on the books that says the state decrees you're not allowed to break your contracts, you're telling me Rothbard wouldn't be for deregulating that regulation? Come on now. He'd say it wouldn't need to be there.
No, he would say it's justice. No. I'm not sure if I'm following you. So let me be clear. As a libertarian anarchist, I ultimately just think of libertarianism as just the justice side of the equation, right? It's not mercy. It's not virtue, or other virtues, I should say. Justice is a virtue. It's not the other virtues. It is just justice. It is just justice applied consistently, right?
Yeah. I'm positive.
Sense, yeah,
I'm positive that the Rothbard would say that law doesn't actually need to exist. The punishment for the contract breaker would come through the fact that people wouldn't want to do business with them. You know, in Ancapistan, you wouldn't need an actual law to say don't break contracts. people would just learn very quickly the contract breakers, are bad for business, and they'd be punished by the free market mechanism. Would you not say that?
I don't know. I mean, the thing that's jumping to mind actually is the LA riots, where Rothbard was like, the police need to stop holding back and put this down, So I think you might underestimate how strong justice is a component of libertarian.
That was him saying that in this imperfect world where we've got state mandated police, they have to apply the law.
Yeah, but
this is slightly different.
He was saying in that case that they would be doing they would be doing the right thing. He'd rather that it was, a private agency rather than the state police, right? But that, well, to talk about the Antifa violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think libertarians would generally say, well, we should just let them go around and burn people's businesses down. No,
because
stop
that's
it,
the protection of private property.
I wish it wasn't the state police, but it is correct for them to do that thing, even if I'd rather it was someone else doing it. It should be done, right? It is a correct thing to do. It's a correct thing to enforce contracts. It's a correct thing to stop lying and stop stealing and murder and violence. These are all correct things to do, right?
I'm not buying for a second, though, this idea that it's in the nature of liberalism to not want to relax, to not want to make it easier to divorce is the illiberal position somehow. I just don't. I mean, why do
I know I'm stretching a little there because it feels weird to say that, but listen to what I said though. In giving us that, the no-fault divorce, we're taking something away, right? Which is something that was viewed as quite a high value by Europeans not too long ago. That is the ability to engage in a mutual agreement that was upheld by society. Let's even ignore the law for a moment. Upheld by society, widely viewed as the right thing to do. And so, there's no assurances in life, but you had some degree of confidence that when you entered a marriage, your marriage partner would stay with you. When you entered in an agreement with your Lord, you'd both keep it, right? Well, that's a pretty valuable thing for interdependence, for cooperation in society, right?
But wouldn't liberals say, well, that's a private matter ultimately? It's not really for the law to decide. And I can imagine like Ronald Reagan phoning up Milton Friedman saying, hey, Milt, what do you make of this change I want to make? No fault divorce. And he'd be like, yeah, I can't really think of an old school classical liberal reason to oppose this. Go for it. It's in the name of liberty type thing. Because all those things are a matter between you and your church or you and your wife or whatever. It's not for the law to decide. Whereas the the true kind of I guess from a big state conservative point of view, I'm thinking, I don't know, like trying to think of a good example, like a Pat Buchanan, say, or whoever it might be. They'd say, no, you need that law there in law, with the full force of the state behind it. You don't break your marriage contract on pain of death. In the ultimate, if you go back to like Puritan times, they'd be like, it'd be death, right? So I'm just on a sliding scale of that position versus repeal. I would say the liberals clearly aren't on the side of death penalty for those who break their marriage vows. Clearly, that's the illiberal side of that equation.
Marriage is a tricky one because, like C.S. Lewis, I believe in separation of marriage and state, and I think as we saw with Reagan, redefining what marriage meant, right, with this legislative change, the state putting marriage in the hands of the state has not been good for marriage, in my view, right? Just like everything else you put in the hands of the state. But that's not really the issue. The issue is whether a liberal believes that contract enforcement as part of justice, and we certainly do. Absolutely, that's one of the bedrock aspects of liberalism. Didn't you know that?
No. I mean, I totally accept that without contracts, there is no liberalism, right? I mean, it's at the heart of Lockean theory, and
no, I'm not talking about social contract. I'm talking about
I'm talking about the
real
I'm talking about
contract.
the system of property rights. The system of and sure, but
now
I still
wait. Let me keep pressing the point.
Go on.
Well, I've got you on the ropes. Let me keep pressing the point. I think the next move I want to make then, in pointing out that liberalism is strong on contracts, is to say that clearly we have changed. Europeans have changed over the last several hundred years, or more than that, where our notion of the sanctity of contracts and agreements, and how often they ought to be done, and how sacred they are, and all that, has become, to use your term, it's become sort of more materialist, less spiritual, right?
Yep.
It's quantity over quality type of thing, right? I think I might have even heard people say things like, it's just a contract, right? Who in 1381 would speak in such a way, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
There's a rich tradition that's pre-Christian, in fact, of how terrible it is to be an oath breaker, right? In Northern Europe, you have this so strongly. So, I do think perhaps that taking that tradition of cooperating together and having mutual agreements, mutual promises, oaths to each other, all that sort of thing, that has been watered down until finally the only thing we have left is marriage, and it's on its last legs, right? I think is not a good development. Is it the fault of liberalism? I don't know, but it's certainly the fault of the autonomy, the emphasis on autonomy.
I believe that it is the fault of liberalism, because it is the separation. I mean, people talk about the separation of church and state, right? The reason that marriage had such a weight is because it was backed by law, whether it was the king, or whether it was the the body of the church, which was given serious power to back up the so it was given proper. So you saying, well, it's in the hands of the state. Well, it was in the hands of a secular state, right? That kind of right. In this country, if you have a civil ceremony, you're not even allowed to mention God. It's like right, because it has to be secular by its nature. So I would say that the illiberal position on this would be to say, yes, it was a liberal mistake to disempower the church, because you defanged the religion, and the demise of the religion was basically it was bound to happen after that point, because now the church is toothless. Now the church can't do anything.
Yeah, and let me be clear. Along with democracy, viewing democracy as something that would bring more freedom, something I noticed in the great liberal thinkers of the 20th century was that they felt that the hostility towards religion that got mixed up with classical liberalism, especially, of course, in the French Revolution, was a huge mistake.
And in Mill, yep.
And Mill, yeah. And so I see this most clearly, believe it or not, in Mises, Hayek, and Hoppe. All three of them, I don't have the quotes to hand, but all three of them, I've got them underlined, saying this was a huge mistake. We look back now and we realize how bad this was. Hoppe obviously has probably thought this through better than Mises and Hayek, right? Knowing him. But that it was something that was viewed as part of classical liberalism, but Mises, Hayek, and Hoppe go, no, that's not an essential element of liberalism. It was a mistake to conflate it with liberalism, just as it was a mistake to conflate democracy with liberalism.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's in the nature of um, the of negative liberty as a concept and of what liberalism drives towards doing, is that it's always going to, whether it's in the social sphere, the economic sphere, or any other sphere, it's always just going to take away Chesterton's fences. Put it that way. It's always just going to break down old laws and rules that seem useless or irrational or holding back progress. It's always going to do those things because they don't seem, how can they be justified? It's 2020, bro, or it's 2021, bro, and that's always. I feel like liberalism is always going to take that first step of removing the law, and then regardless of what individual libertarians or liberals will say, they've already taken the first step, and the leftists can do the rest after that. The radicals can do the rest. But the removal of the initial law, I mean, the very fact that you said it was Ronald Reagan who did that, in most people's mind, Ronald Reagan is a kind of at the intersection of conservatism and liberalism, right? I mean, that's what he was.
Right. Well, he admired FDR, shall we say? I'll say that about him. I had a point I wanted to make. Oh boy, sorry, I'm looking at your slide about degeneracy, and then that got me thinking. Right. Okay. Well. Oh yeah. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. Another person I thought about a lot listening to your videos was Hayek. Hayek is not to be underestimated, despite him being a hedgehog. Mises thought he was very smart, for one thing. He said, "Oh, if only I had had another Hayek," near the end of his life, supposedly. Hayek, in his later work, starts focusing on tradition. Basically, one might say, though I don't think he is at all influenced by him, one might say Chesterton type of stuff. And he seems to be, I think, struggling with some of the same things that you're talking about right now. And so I think Hayek would repay Hayek's writings on these matters. And I'm blanking right now on where sort of the best source for this is in his books. But he's really wrestling with this very thing, that tradition is just automatically assumed to have zero or even negative value. And he argues, I'm not so sure about that. And now he takes a sort of cultural evolution approach to it. This is a practice that has lasted in a society that has been sustainable for a long time. And so we basically Chesterton's point, right? We ought to automatically have a sort of bias that maybe there's something to this, and be super, super cautious about destroying it, right? But so interestingly, Hayek ends up being more of a sort of a right winger in this regard, even though he's thought of as sort of the soft libertarian, right?
There is an issue even to this though as well. And I say this as someone who went very, very far down this road myself of an evolutionary view of everything. Right. There's a great Matt Ridley book in this tradition called The Evolution of Everything.
I'm almost done with it. I've just been reading it.
I recommend people read. But the problem with The Evolution of Everything is that in the final analysis, the leftists can always just say, well, this is the next stage in evolution. Right? I mean, this is the next step of we've progressed this far. Why not take this next step?
History with a capital H, right? Yeah, history is leading us towards this.
And so then you get the the Burkean conservative problem of you're just progressivism driving at the speed limit, ultimately.
Yeah, right.
Which is a problem with that strain of conservatism rather than libertarianism, but that's a different video and different debate, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know how much more I want to try to do today, because we could just kind of go on and on. I think there's a lot to talk about. I'm just looking through your slides, thinking about. I guess the last thing I wanted to touch on. I'm not sure.
Remember, a core part of my argument was that negative and positive liberty are the same, and that Berlin's distinction falls down. Do you remember that? That was a
right, and I have a paper countering that, and it was just a little bit too much technical philosophy for me. But to summarize as much as I was able to understand, he says part of the problem with the triad is that in throwing off oppression, it can just be a dyad. That is, I'm not throwing off oppression because of wanting to do a particular thing. I just don't want to be oppressed. You know, I'll figure out what happens next later. But he argued that breaks the triad, which is important somehow. Anyway, I can send it to you and see what you think. Right. So you showed a picture from the Crusades, right? Crusaders on one side and the Saracens on the other, or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And you said, you know, what do we see when we look at this? And you argued that the liberal sees a bunch of individuals just wastefully killing each other, where, you know, the reactionary, the traditionalist, whatever, sees matters of higher import at play, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I said Schmidt would see friend enemy. I quoted Hilaire Belloc seeing a important battle between Christians and one of their eternal enemies, and I said like a kind of Nietzschean style reactionary would say this is kind of a masculine, you know, this is history, capital H history, the true nature of it, men fighting essentially. So I mean, it depends which one of those ways you go, but the true liberal, I would say, would only see individuals here and a non-profitable waste of life. You know, their labor could be reallocated to more productive ends. They should be trading, Radlib, not fighting.
Right. Well, and I'm a big anti-war guy. And so, you know, I'm in sympathy with not wanting people to be killing each other. Having said that, I, just for what it's worth, as someone who tries in his own way to be in the Canaan Dean tradition, you might say, what do I see? Well, of course, I don't accept this view of liberalism properly understood as being about atomistic individualism. In fact, it's funny that reactionaries are so attached to that view of liberalism, because you know who really that comes from, right?
Go on.
Karl Marx. He's the one who first smeared liberalism as being about atomistic individualism. His point being that only under, you know, his system would we really have proper social cooperation. And the kind of social cooperation that the liberals praised was, you know, I don't know. He just didn't seem to think it was real or something. I don't know. So in as much as reactionaries say that, they're Marxists, right? But so I don't look at this and see merely individuals, right? Because, as I said, as a liberal, I see people working together, and I don't see it as about autonomy. I see it as about interdependence. And so I see two groups of men who are each, you know, they're working together, they're agreeing together on what the goal is, and they're pursuing that goal. Now, if I want to give a justice analysis, I'm going to want to know more than the picture, right? I mean, is one side invading the land of the other side? Even as a Christian, just because I see some crosses on one side doesn't mean I automatically assume that they have justice on their side. Because, of course, we've seen people use the cross for evil, right? Jesus said, some will say to me, Lord, Lord, and I'll say, I don't know who you are, you know. So some people, even who do things in the name of God, are in fact doing evil and something that's ungodly.
No.
So,
friend good, enemy bad, kill heathen. No.
Well, it's not that simple in the scriptures, right? I mean, the Old Testament is primarily filled with prophets telling the state of Israel how bad it's being, even though they're the chosen ones and all this stuff. So, were I there at the scene, I don't know, I'd have to know what's going on. I'd have to ask the Lord, I might be denouncing the Crusaders and telling them, stop doing the evil thing you're doing in the name of God and go back home, or whatever. I'd have to understand the situation. So anyway, just a few reactions as a Christian liberal.
But didn't you prove my point?
In what way?
My point was that the liberal couldn't just say the bloody obvious thing: friend good, enemy bad, or this is for the Christian and against the heathen, or just glorying in the masculine violence of the thing.
It's not that. It's that who is my. A lot of people claim to be my friend who aren't, right? Right. That's being, what is it? Be gentle as doves and wise as serpents, right? I am not accepting in my own country, America is number one kind of attitude, right? Just, my side, right or wrong, make them all pay, right? I mean, I wrote against this after September 11th. So yeah, I don't know how to parse that in terms of liberalism or whatever. To me, it's just not being an idiot. You don't just sign on to anybody who comes along and says that, oh yeah, I'm doing this for you, buddy. It's like, yeah, maybe you are, maybe not.
But I mean, this does go to my, in the video I was being a bit facetious, but I'd say, wouldn't Abdul, be better off sitting at home ordering takeaways and watching TV, or I mean,
right? Well, okay. I mean, you use war as a provocative example, but obviously, I think it's better for people to order themselves to a higher, to spiritual things and not to be materialist, right? And in fact, for me, I don't view. I'm not in liberalism for the materialism, so to speak. It's a side benefit, as we know, that liberal economics tends to yield, prosperity and so forth. But maybe better to understand it as options, and you can use those options to, just get rich, I guess, or you can use them to start a monastery or something, right?
I mean, can you imagine trying to sit down with one of these crusaders and telling them what you just said to me?
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
What would you say to them? What would he say?
Some of the ways that not just you, but some of our reactionary friends picture the people in the past doesn't seem right to me. I mean, I wrote these articles about the scholastics, right? I mean. Yeah. These are smart people who are thinking through things in a principled, logical way, right? I think there's, to some degree in your characterization here, it smacks of some of the smear job, right? Basically, back then they were all sort of cavemen who went around whomping things that they didn't like or whatever. That's not Christendom. That's not our heritage. Our heritage is, the one that gets mocked by our secular friends who talk about, like the British are talking about, debating over how many angels are on the head of a pin. I've heard him make that joke. What that is talking about in a negative, pejorative way is that, the scholastic, the great philosophers of Christianity thought very carefully, rigorously, and logically. That's the heritage of Christendom.
Okay, so these guys on horseback, Radlib, right?
Bonk, bonk,
These guys on horseback. They sat down. They read the church fathers. They read Saint Augustine. They read Aquinas, and then they said, "Friend good, enemy bad." I mean, their conclusion to all of that was, yeah, let's go lance some heathens in the name of God.
Perhaps, but I think were I to sit down with them and say, when you did this, I think it was just, it was godly. But when you do this other thing, I think it's ungodly. Then I think we could have had an intelligent, moral conversation about it. It wouldn't just be, no, I can just do whatever the hell I want because I'm the good guy. That's not how they were, I don't think.
Okay, they only went on They only went on 4 separate crusades, but it's not who they were. Come on, now.
I think we would need to. I am not as good on the Crusades as I'd like to be, but what little I've read, again, we need to not see the Crusades through the distorted lens that we've been given, right? We need to understand them a little bit.
They wanted to win back the Holy Land from the heathen in the name of God. No? Oh, okay.
I don't know. Like I said, I would like to dig into the details more. In matters of war, side point, because one of these days I do want to start an anti-war show. In matters of these sorts of conflict and war, if you come at it with just an a priori, like, I don't know, white people always do the right thing, or Christians always do the right thing, or whatever, I don't think you're going to have a very useful analysis. You have to dig into the details of these situations. What looks like unjust violence might in fact be, winning back something that had been taken wrongly. So you really have to know the details. I can't just look at this and go, oh yeah, I know which ones the good guys are. Well, I don't know which battle was it? Where was this? What was going on? I need to know about it.
Now we've discussed this, Radlib. I just love the idea. I absolutely love the idea of these guys, these kind of medieval knights, shouting as they went into battle. On the contrary, Peter Lombard said, and then just kind of charging the Saracens with scholastic kind of justifications of their arguments. I think that would be amazing if they did that.
Okay, well, let's do some super chats. I'm going to have to wrap it up. Let me see. I'm being asked by the wife when I'll be off. Okay. Let me pull up super chats and let's hit some of these. And I know that this isn't a fully satisfactory discussion. You brought up a lot of stuff and a lot of deep stuff. And I knew that number one, I don't have the time to do the scholarship that you do. But number two, there's a lot to discuss about this. So I'm afraid people might have come thinking they'd get sort of, a final debate. And instead, I really meant to I meant to hopefully usefully continue the conversation and bring up some things for people to think about. In particular, people like Canaan Dean, who seem to square these circles that seem in tension for a lot of reactionaries right now. Okay, so Avalok says liberty is a method, not an end. Telos greater than liberty. I'm comfortable with that. Hunger says, we've all moved from Mises to Carlyle in some sense, just a natural reaction to living in the winter of civilization. Interesting. Jacob, Radlib, you were the chosen one. You were meant to destroy the... Oh, he's saying I should be saying this. You were the chosen one. You were meant to destroy the status, not join them. Use methodological distinction, not the friend-enemy distinction. You were a classical liberal AA. I loved you. Anyway, I think you kind of addressed that near the end of the third video, right? What your motivations are.
My point in a lot of this, and I made the same point even in my book. I didn't go as far, I didn't talk about Schmitt and stuff, but I did talk about the elite theorists, is that to have any hope at all, liberals also need to get real to some extent.
Yes, that I totally agree with.
And some part of the friend enemy distinction, and and the way that power works has to be, unless liberals come to terms with that, they're just going to keep having their asses handed to them over and over and over again. Same with conservatives. And in fact, I actually wonder whether they are deliberately weak. That was part of my thesis, that it's the right as it's been formed since 1945 is a kind of false flag opposition, all over, because I didn't get into it. Even within libertarianism, it's the weaker, it's not Mises and Rothbard, it's the Milton Friedman style. It's not Pat Buchanan, it's Ronald Reagan. It's so it's always the weaker. It's always the weaker face,
or even worse, Bill Kristol.
Yeah, you got one exactly. Yeah, I mean, the okay. Yeah. Anyway, carry on.
Nikki says, I think that Rothbard does not accept the premise that absolute freedom is the goal. Rather, he views freedom as the logical conclusion of the premise of rejection of the use of force, or I would say aggressive force. I mean, I would say a lot of what you were saying sounded like portions out of Ethics of Liberty by Rothbard, where he said, we can smuggle in our ethical assumptions here to, economics, for example, right? We've got to state our ethical views and argue for them, ideally.
Rothbard does say, but Rothbard does what, in the interest of strict fairness, Rothbard does say, I can't remember exactly what he says, I think in Ethics of Liberty, but it might be somewhere else, that only an idiot would see freedom as the ultimate end. He means it strictly in the legal sense, not in the ethical sense.
And that is my view. And you'll notice in my Twitter bio, I put Christian first and then libertarian second. That's no accident, and it's been that way for 13 years, I think.
Well, I mean, my contention is, though, Radlib, is that that without backing by force, the personal sphere or the private sphere is just for the birds.
What do you mean? It's just for the birds?
Well, you and Rothbard can be personally strong, but the trucks of this world need the force to, make them be good. I.e., without some strong, without some weight behind it, and by weight I mean actual the threat of force, most people are going to over time become more degenerate as opposed to more principled and virtuous as you are.
Right. Well, I totally disagree, because if you mean by it what I think you mean by it, that is injustice. I do not think injustice gets us closer to the virtuous life.
Okay, carry on.
Hunger says, libertarianism was an 18th and 19th century left-wing movement. The minute it became right-wing after World War II, it stopped being effective. It was always about subverting an established order. I don't know that I have a lot to say about that.
I would say that the liberal victories have all been in directions that leftists would have wanted since 1945. I.e., drug legalization.
Right. Well, he's making a larger claim that it was always about subverting an established order, and therefore always, left-wing, going back to the 18th century.
Mm-hmm.
Raging Mandrill says, have you gents read Imperium by C.A. Bond? It touches on how free marketeers help to centralize power via repeal of the Corn Laws.
That's interesting. No, I haven't, but I'd be certainly interested to see.
Seems to be being mentioned in reactionary circles. Imperium by C.A. Bond, if you want to jot that down.
Interesting. Same title as the Occupy book, of course.
Chris Lutio says, I'd highly recommend that you check out The Memory Book by Harry Lorraine and Jerry Lucas. It generalizes the memory palace technique with imagination.
Interesting. Okay, I will. The Memory Book. I'll check that out.
Got it. Okay, Blue Lambo, comma, black president says, thoughts on Austro-libertarianism. Why are an econ school and a political philosophy intertwined? Are Austrianism and libertarianism separable? And if so, are or were there any intellectuals trying to do so? Well, I suppose Hoppe, maybe, from a certain point of view. What do you think?
Just repeat the question again, sorry.
Thoughts on Austro-libertarianism. Why is a school of economics and a school of political philosophy intertwined? Are Austrianism and libertarianism separable? And if so, are there any intellectuals trying to do that?
Me.
I was going to say, yeah. But it also seems like Hoppe, I don't know, he would not necessarily view himself as trying to separate Austrianism and libertarianism, but I would say that Hoppe's project and what you have been up to don't seem that distant in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that phrase Austro-libertarian, like Walter Block uses it, doesn't he? And De Lorenzo, I've got a book here by them that uses that label. But the Austro-libertarian is effectively a branding tool for Rothbardians to demarcate themselves from, the lolbirds, effectively.
Yeah. The Cato Institute and the Chicago School and etc.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and that they're building from the ethics of Rothbard. I mean, even Walter Block, someone like that, still maintains a strict difference between his economic papers and his libertarian papers.
Mm-hmm. To keep the wertfrei, the value-free nature of the economics. Yeah,
exactly. So when he's doing an Austro-libertarian critique, yeah, he's using some of the tools of economics, but it's with an actually morally normative focus. Right. Where he's doing pure economics, it's just a wertfrei. Yeah.
Glow in the Dark says marriage is a contract, not only a vow but a written agreement nowadays. Yeah, did I sign something? I suppose I did. Mickey says the destruction of marriage is a form of oppression by the state against religious freedom in the name of protection of that freedom. Yeah, like I hinted, I think that marriage, biblically speaking, precedes both the church and the state. And so I think there ought to at least be separation of marriage and state. And some churches I wouldn't trust with marriage, that's for sure. And I think, like I said, marriage in the hands of the state, it hasn't been so great for marriage. And so as the state takes over more and more spheres of our life that had a lot more to do with private enforcement, basically, social pressure and things like that, it takes them over and then it pauses them, right? I mean, that's the pattern we see. Which is why I'm a little confused why you blame liberalism. It's I mean, unless you want to call the social democratic states of the 20th century liberal states, which
Radlib?
What? Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
I mean, as someone who's been divorced once, hopefully never again, if there was if there had been enforcement by the sword, probably that divorce wouldn't have happened. If there had been like intense social pressure, or her, let's say a father threatened to kill me or something,
right?
Probably that divorce wouldn't have happened. So right. I mean, I'm just saying, like, I'm proffering myself as an example of someone who may have someone who probably would have stuck by something, had there been more of an illiberal enforcement of that contract.
Remember the thing I said recently? I said, if you listen to AA and just take a lot of what he's saying is about himself, it all makes a lot more sense.
No, that's almost never true. So when I was talking about geeks, I was not talking about myself. But I mean, in this, in this case, I do think that more people, like, I mean, it's obvious. More. I mean, I'm going to do a video soon. My next video in this series is going to be comparing, life under Steve Pinker's, utopia versus life under the intense Puritanism of the New England colonies, right? I'm going to be looking at a set of colonies where you could be arrested for disobeying your parents, where if you hadn't married by a certain age, you'd be forced into exile at sword point. Okay. So right. An intensely illiberal Puritan order, literally the places where they did the witch trials, and looking basically on paper to see what their crime rate was, to see what their birth rates was, to see what their marriage rates were, versus the intensely liberal order of the of the 1960s, say, or the 1970s, right. where even if you could say, well, yeah, there was a welfare state and so on, it's definitely less liberal than the Puritan order. Everybody would agree. And looking at the results, and if any of us were living in that Puritan thing, most of you would be married.
Mm-hmm. Right,
anyway,
right. No insults, right? Mickey says secularism is the new state religion in today's Western world. People follow the church of secular, scare quotes, liberal democracy. In its name, they oppress. Yeah, and I think that's one thing, forgetting about what we can blame on liberalism and all that for a moment. One thing is that somehow, maybe especially this last year, it doesn't feel like we're living in freedom, does it? I mean, it does feel like the current order is rather oppressive in a lot of ways.
Oh, I mean, it's illiberal. But yeah. my point, my argument has been the handmaiden to the illiberal, so leftists have been liberal, quote unquote, racists who've paved the way for, you remove the law, and then somebody who's willing to impose their will on the world will be like, okay, what? You're going to just let us do this and you're not going to push back? All right, then I'll stamp on your head. Mm-hmm. To which the answer must be, no, I stamp on yours.
Okay, EC90 says if you are interested in looking at liberalism under dictatorship, the Kingdom of Bhutan, Drak Yul, is an interesting case study. Bhutan, I don't even know what part of the world that is. Sorry, I'm an American. Bhutan is Kingdom of Bhutan, landlocked country in the eastern Himalayas.
Okay.
Oh, interesting. Okay. He's saying that's liberalism under dictatorship. Yeah, and then some have argued that, Pinochet's Chile was something along those lines, right?
Liechtenstein, maybe. As well.
What did you Liechtenstein?
Yeah, Singapore. I'm just trying to think of examples of.
Yeah, right. Okay, a few more have come in. Just chat. AA, your buddy Steve Davies from the Institute for Economic Affairs, who gave your book a thumbs up, referred to right libertarians as libertarian Nazis. What do you think about that?
I mean,
have to see more on that, I think.
Yeah, I'd have to see what his justifications were. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's worth noting, by the way, that right at the end of the video, AA named names, and in talking about someone who'd been critical of Hoppe and some of these other reactionary thinkers that AA's been talking about recently, he mentioned Jeffrey Tucker, who I know quite well. I actually worked for him when he was vice president at the Mises Institute. He ran Mises.org, the website at that time, and I did some editing for the website, or website type editing work, librarian work. And yeah, I haven't followed his writings on this topic. But I do remember that as Trump was heading towards becoming president, Jeffrey really seemed to be freaking out and saying, here comes fascism, and, I wouldn't say that, I would say Trump's no Ron Paul, but I remember feeling like it seemed a little bit of an overreaction to Trump. personally.
Yeah, I mean, Tucker's written he's written an article on Evola, basically saying this guy's a fascist. Wrote one on Carlyle, calling him a proto-fascist. And so he basically went through a reading list and then did a bunch of articles on Fee, which is a good site. It's got a lot of good stuff on it. But basically just saying, look at the alt-right are basically just Nazis.
Right. And so basically he's worked through a lot of the literature you've been looking at, and you've been finding that you think they have some interesting points, and you feel like, in particular, what you said in the video is that he seems rather dismissive and shallow in his analysis. He doesn't give it a charitable reading and say, what are their concerns here? Well,
he doesn't read them. He just basically uses it as an opportunity to say, don't read this, it's fascist, which is always an intellectually suspect move. And I wonder why Jeffrey Tucker's doing that.
So you didn't see a deep, like I said, I didn't read those articles. You didn't see a deep engagement in the sense of really reading, really getting what their concerns are, talking about those and saying, but the way they want to deal with those concerns, I think, is wrong or whatever. It's not even that much, right?
Yeah, I mean, I felt that he was just kind of writing hit pieces to try to basically make the point. I mean, he even tries to use a kind of horseshoe argument in the Evola article, saying that some of his arguments are almost like far left in character. And it's I don't know, it's just a hit piece basically. And I feel like, and he picks out bits where Evola is seemingly a bit sexist, but you've got to understand that Evola is outlining the view of tradition. That's what he does a lot of the time, and the view of tradition wasn't feminist. Right. I mean, it's just true. I'm just looking at he's labeled that section of it the girl problem. And this is not like some kind of SJW. This is somebody who wrote for the Mises Institute for years. So it's like, why is he SJWing? Like, why is he behaving like this? And this is part of the, I can only imagine that it becomes from the root of what I said, which is that somebody like Jeffrey Tucker essentially shares the underpinnings of the liberal left. They basically agree. Freedom, materialism. What was the other one? Equality.
Right. I think we've got one last one. Glow in the Dark says younger generation doesn't understand older generation's rules, laws, and wisdom till they are older, and without the ability to change anything. I don't follow that last point, but I am sympathetic. That is an aspect of tradition. I don't know that I've heard you talking about that, or that you've seen it in like Evola. There's this. I notice in older societies, there's a view that you're kind of too young to propose such a big change. Like it's basically an application of Chesterton's fence. Like, when you're 19. You probably are not ready to remodel our society, buddy. You need to have a little more experience, understand why we do things the way we do them. Then maybe we can, join the Council of Elders and let's talk, right?
Evola is strangely thinks about youth a lot. He's got a whole book called A Handbook for Right-Wing Youth, and he sees it as an important thing to talk to the youth. And he's preoccupied by, he'll surprise you in all sorts of ways. He in Ride the Tiger, he talks about why have you got punks and hippies and people acting out all across the West? What is it that they got in these young people's heads? And for him, it's just a kind of sign of culture-wide existential angst. Basically, they're acting out because they've got all this energy. It's nihilistic rage. They don't really know what they're doing. So he has a lot of strategies for trying to like harness that youthful energy into a more productive end. But I mean, Evel is a very particular, very kind of. He's not representative of anything but himself, I would say. He's just one of those peculiar
right. But
figures
it sounds like he's saying something that I think a lot, right? Which is, you see people doing maybe some crazy stuff, but the thing that they're reacting to is a real problem, right? In many cases, if people are feeling a lack of meaning, that's because there is kind of a lack of meaning in our society right now, right? And then they're filling it. They're filling it in ways that are nuts. But I mean, the vacuum is there. The vacuum is a real thing.
Yeah, and you see, it gets pretty complicated. I mean, Tucker wants to just say, well, this is a fascist. You read Everly, you'll turn into Hitler type thing. It's not really the case. I mean, in some ways, he is like a super individualist, and he's trying to say, like, look, you're living in some of the most difficult, trying conditions. You're surrounded by nihilism and existential angst, and it's going to get worse, and girls are going to turn into boys, and boys are going to turn into girls, and like how the hell do you?
He predicted that.
Oh yeah, he's got a whole essay where he basically says, soon the distinction between the sexes is going to start to evaporate because there's nothing left to rebel against apart from biological reality itself. And what he's trying to do is like, listen, there's not a lot you can do about this. You're kind of stuck in. You don't get to choose which bit of history you're born into. So here's a set of tactics. Here's a set of strategies to kind of ride the tiger. That's essentially what he said. What Evel is all about. So in a strange way, he's a much more individualistic thinker than. Like the word collectivist doesn't feel like it fits with him because he was an elitist. He was against the mass man. If you read his critiques of fascism, it's all because it's popular. Like he wouldn't like Trump because it's too populist. It's too mass. It can only be elite. It can only be the aristocrats of the soul who can make a difference. Everything. But anyway, let's not get down this rabbit hole too much.
I remember the old right, older men really speaking a lot about Jose Ortega y Gasset. Yeah, have you heard this name? And
I haven't read him. He does keep on being mentioned though. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I'm feeling like gonna have to read him at some point, and I cannot seem to find his. Here we go. Main work is he wrote a ton of stuff. The Revolt of the Masses, 1930. That's the big one. Let me just drop that in the chat.
And I want to say.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I want to say that I think one of the reasons I've come across this guy is because he is cited by Eveler, among others. He's kind of in the literature, this guy. Yeah.
Right. But I was hearing about him from old right / like basically one of the guys from Fee that, I met him when he was 93 or whatever. I think he was one of the guys who said, oh yeah, Revolt of the Masses. You got to read that. So there's this, I guess elitism there. Okay, so Mickey says, human rights take from you the right to subscribe to institutions that will, for example, enforce your marriage by sword with your permission to do to you what HR prohibits state. Human rights prohibit the state from doing. Human rights today are therefore illiberal. I think I followed that, maybe.
Yeah, but the reason that human rights are reign is because the set of older laws were cleared away by liberals so again the liberals acted as the handmaidens to the illiberal reign of human rights. If that makes sense. So effectively what I'm saying is in order to make way for these new leftist illiberal laws, there had to be a set of rightist illiberal laws that were cleared. So step one is liberalism, step two is socialism every single time.
Yeah. Okay, so Glow in the Dark says over-examination is a problem with the West. When you're too busy examining the atoms, you don't realize the bigger picture. Maybe. And there's been a lot of attempts, right, to fill the vacuum. Existentialism and, right? I mean, on and on and on. Basically, the problem that Nietzsche said, with God dead, what do we do now, right? And there's been a lot of attempts to try to fix it.
Yeah, but I guess I mean going back to Evola, or even some of these other people who aren't really from the liberal tradition, they're seen as being a part of a different kind of right wing tradition. Those guys at least attempt to answer that question, whereas liberalism, it feels to me, cannot answer that question.
I'm sorry, liberalism can't answer what question?
The question posed by Nietzsche.
Well, of course.
Ride the Tiger is effectively Evola's attempt to answer that question. Or I don't know, any of these guys, they're grappling with that bigger existential non-material question. Whereas liberalism can only ever really say, well, the state shouldn't be involved.
No, that's
and beyond that,
I think if you're looking to liberalism for a whole life philosophy, for spirituality, so on and so forth, I think you're looking in the wrong place. And all the liberals say that. They say that this isn't a religion; it's just justice. That's all it is. And justice doesn't tell you what to do with your life. It doesn't tell you how to be a good father. It doesn't tell you how to be a kind, loving, wise person. You can't get all these things from liberalism. You just get justice. That's it.
But justice needs to be enforced, though, does it not? It needs to be enforced.
Right.
And I guess one of the things that I have thought more and more, maybe I'm wrong, it's always possible, that I feel like a lot of these social things need a big stick behind them to carry on maintaining themselves. And once that stick is taken away, usually through the repeal of some law or other, the culture follows. You make it easier to get a sex change, and guess what? More people will have sex changes. You make it easier to, I don't know, whatever it happens to be. Let's just say make it easy to be degenerate, and lo and behold, you have an epidemic of degeneracy. So that's my. That's
but I feel like you're leaving out half of the story, right? So okay, yeah, was there a law against sex changes? I don't think there was, but let's say there was, and they got rid of it. There's a little more going on than that, right? The state subsidizes certain behavior. We know, as you pointed out, we know this about the mass immigration, the demographic change. This is something the state is actually engineering and funding with our tax money, right? And in so many other ways, what is it? Gottfried's great lecture I'm always telling people to watch. Political correctness is political, or however he puts it. This stuff is happening because it's being pushed. It's not just spontaneous. You're kind of like making it sound like the laws go away and then everybody just starts doing this stuff. That's not exactly what we've been seeing, right? The state is pushing this stuff hardcore.
Step one is repeal. Step two is leftist push. So the handmaiden work is already done by the liberals, and on the issue of immigration, right? It was the liberal, the Milton Friedman argument to make immigration easier in the 70s. The unions were the ones who were against it, and then lo and behold, 20, 30 years later, it's the left position to mandate, to force immigration now as a kind of human right for some person halfway around the world to be your next door neighbor.
Well, if you're going to get into the history of it, 1965 Immigration Act is the big switch in the U.S. Turnip could probably give us the right details on this, but I'm going to guess that was not exactly coming from libertarians, the 1965 Immigration Reform Act or whatever it was. So in that particular example, I don't know that would hold up if you dug into the details of the history.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to have to wrap it up, and I don't know if this was very satisfying because, like I said, I'm just throwing out various things. Oh, speaking of which, I did have one more thing. Yeah. So I just didn't know what to do when we were going to have this talk because, like I said, I'm not going to be able to absorb all the literature you've been absorbing in a week or even in a year because I just don't have time. So I just prayed, and Canaan Dean came to mind. But also, like the very day, the next morning after I found out we were going to have this, the scripture portion, I've been listening as I drive to the gym. The scripture portion was relevant to the egalitarianism stuff that you brought up. Let me just share it. Legend of Korah, I'm going to call it, except it's Korah. In this case, it's from Numbers. This is when they're in the desert. The Israelites have left Egypt. They're in the desert wandering around. Moses and Aaron, right? Aaron is the priest and establishing the priestly tribe of the Levites. And Moses is the prophet or whatever, the leader. And so these people come as a group to oppose Moses and Aaron and said to them, you have gone too far. The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Are you hearing this, AA?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly? Well, it's worth just skipping forward to what happens to Korah and the others aligned with him. The ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them and their households, and all those associated with Korah, together with their possessions. They went down alive into the realm of the dead with everything they owned. The earth closed over them, and they perished and were gone from the community. So there's the Bible on egalitarianism in a nutshell.
Well, Radlib, I just want to say I stressed during this, friend good, enemy bad. Yeah. But me and you are friends, so that's all good, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, and I don't know how much people are picking up on it, but I'm following the things that you're thinking about with great interest and trying not to be like Jeffrey Tucker, shall we say. I think you're bringing up really significant issues that really need to be discussed. And, the vacuum of meaning, the emphasis on autonomy, it's all a big, big problem, right? And it's hurting people. It's hurting people, I know. They're being given guidance that is, I think they're going to make choices that they're going to regret,
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things we didn't get into as well is that, of course, for the sake of an argument, you push on extremes, as I talked about, and that means cutting out certain bits of nuance. I mean, I struggle immensely with the Little John Smith problem. You'd be like, well, why shouldn't he be a dancer if he wants to be? I mean,
I was thinking as a father, I love my son, and he's in agony because he's not getting to do what he wants to do.
So there's not an easy. It's not an easy answer to a lot of these things, but a lot of the time I'm posing arguments that nobody will have ever heard before or even thought about before.
Right?
And from the point of view of the 1381 order, to try to give it its strongest face to jolt people out of their everyday thinking. Sometimes you have to put things, sometimes you have to clear your mind a little bit of your own doubts. Yeah.
Here's what I totally agree with reactionaries. I just don't think they always do it well. And that is, it is past time to ask fundamental questions, to go back, to figure out what the things that were good, how were they there? How did they really work? Not the way we're told they work by the horrible historians we're plagued with now, right? Who are always just trying to tell a story of progress away from the darkness and towards the light. Those of us who are ready to go back and draw some useful lessons from the past, right? This needs to be done. We don't understand. You and I think it's fair to say, do not understand Christendom as well as we would like to, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
There's so much more to understand about it.
But look,
we can learn
Radlib,
from.
look, I opened the door to little Johnny dancing, and we've now got years saying we can dance, everybody take off your pants. How can we stop the slippery slope? Anyway, we won't solve it tonight.
I prefer the safety dance, yes. Okay. Okay, so last things to mention, I guess, really quick are that, as I said, we do have a community for this show. Look in the show notes for the Econ Chat Discord, and we're setting up some alt tech so that we're not reliant on Discord's good graces. And so join that as well. Academic Agent has 3 flagship shows. I hope I'm remembering all of them. On Tuesdays, it's Unpopular Opinions. On this morning, right? Thursday mornings, or I'm sorry, it's not Thursday morning for you, but Thursdays, it's The Deepest Lore, which tends to be sort of more cultural sorts of things. And if you enjoyed this conversation, then you should be a loyal, never miss one follower of Friday's series, which is called Cigar Stream. And that's probably where, if it wasn't that I'm working at the time, that's the one I'd want to be on every week, because you guys tend to talk about sort of this kind of stuff. You call it meta politics or whatever, but the deeper questions, much less tied to current events, typically, a little bit more, I guess, philosophical, you might say, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So Cigar Stream, if you are listening to this and you're like, this is the kind of stuff I am thinking about, I am wrestling with, please, Cigar Stream. That's the place for you. And join us, loyal listeners of the Cigar Stream. All right. Well, thanks, sir. It's always good to talk to you. And we are done. Bye, guys.